I knocked on my son-in-law's door with a birthday cake. No answer. I used the spare key, set the cake down, and then, from behind the closed bedroom door, I heard that familiar cough, the same one I'd heard beside me for 38 years. My wife, who had supposedly been resting in a care facility for 8 months, was right there. I turned the handle. My knees buckled. They thought I'd never figure it out. They were wrong. Now they're about to pay, and not just with money. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is in your region right now. My name is Herbert Wallace. I'm 68 years old, and I live at 1847 Oleander Drive in Pasadena, California, a house I've owned since 1991, worth considerably more now than what I paid for it. For 42 years, I worked as an actuary for Northwestern Mutual. If you don't know what an actuary does, here's the short version. I calculated the probability of things going wrong so that other people wouldn't feel the full weight of it when they did. I was good at it. The irony of what I'm about to tell you is not lost on me. I've been retired for 3 years. I iron my shirts on Tuesday evenings, keep my vinyl collection organized by label and year, and read the newspaper in the same chair every morning with the same cup of coffee. 2 sugars, no milk. People who don't know me think I'm cold. People who do know me understand the difference between cold and patient. I don't raise my voice. I don't slam doors. I sit with a problem until I understand it completely, and then I deal with it. Norma and I were married for 38 years. She was warm in the way I was not. Laughed easily, cried at commercials, kept a cat named Marmalade who shed orange fur on every piece of furniture I owned and who I pretended to dislike. We were a good match, one of us always compensating for what the other lacked. Our daughter Megan is 36. I want to be fair when I describe her, because fairness is something I believe in. She is intelligent, organized, composed under pressure. At 12, she kept color-coded binders for every subject. At 22, she negotiated her own starting salary without asking for advice. I was proud of her. I told her so, which is not something I do lightly. Then she married Derek. Derek Carter is 39. He's a real estate broker, a profession built on convincing people that things are worth more than they are. He has the handshake of a man who's practiced it in a mirror and the smile of someone who knows exactly when to deploy it. I noticed all of this at their wedding dinner 9 years ago and thought, Megan is sharp enough to handle him. I underestimated how thoroughly she wouldn't need to. Something shifted in my daughter in the years after that wedding. It was gradual, the way a faucet starts dripping long before it bursts. She became more deliberate around me, more careful. She started calling more often, which I appreciated at first, until I noticed that most of her questions circled the same territory. The house, my pension, my plans. Just making sure you're okay, Dad. And I'd say I was fine, because I was fine, or I believed I was. Megan began accompanying Norma to doctor's appointments. She started speaking on Norma's behalf, answering questions directed at my wife before Norma could respond. I noticed it the way you notice a squeaky step. Every time, briefly, then you carry on. I gave it charitable explanations. That was my first mistake. Then, 8 months ago, things accelerated. Megan arrived at the house with 2 suitcases packed with Norma's clothes. She stood in my kitchen with the calm of someone who had rehearsed this conversation and told me that Norma needed rest, a break from the demands of the household. She was exhausted. Didn't I see it? Megan would provide care and accommodation. All I needed to do was contribute to the costs, $3,200 per month, transferred to Derek's account, since he was managing household finances. I looked at Norma. She stood slightly behind Megan, coat already on, and gave a small nod when she saw me looking. Practice looking, like someone confirming a story they'd been asked to tell. I agreed. I gave them the benefit of the doubt, because that is what you do with your family. Every Sunday I drove to 924 Sycamore Lane in Arcadia and spent 1 hour in their living room with Norma. She sat in the same armchair each time and spoke in measured, careful sentences. Megan was always present. Derek met me at the door on arrival and walked me out at departure. I filed this under courtesy and didn't examine whether it was also something else. 7 payments, $3,200 each, straight through to the following spring. Then came the Friday evening I called Derek to arrange a birthday surprise. His birthday was the following day. I had a tradition: chocolate cake from the bakery on Colorado Boulevard, Megan's preferred style, blue icing. I suggested champagne, a family evening, something simple. Derek said, "Of course, Herbert. Come on by." There was a pause before "of course," half a beat. The kind of pause a man makes when he's been asked something he hadn't prepared for. His voice had the texture of someone agreeing to a thing he hadn't expected to be asked. I said I'd see him the next afternoon. I hung up. I sat in my kitchen in the house on Oleander Drive, which had been very quiet for 8 months, and I listened to that pause. The cake was already ordered. If I was wrong about what that pause meant, we'd have a nice birthday evening. If I wasn't wrong, I needed to see it with my own eyes before I did anything at all. I turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. I didn't sleep well. There's a thing that happens when you've spent 4 decades in actuarial science. You cannot fully turn off the analytical part of your brain. It runs in the background whether you want it to or not, the way a refrigerator hums, constant, unnoticed, until the moment it stops, and you realize it was never not there. Lying awake that night, I stopped fighting it and just let it run. I started cataloging the discrepancies I had filed in the wrong drawer. Norma's reading glasses, tortoiseshell frames, same pair for 3 years, kept in the second drawer of the nightstand on her side of the bed. I found them there the morning after she left. I put them back and thought, she'll ask me to bring them when she needs them. She never did. Not in 8 months. If you knew how Norma couldn't read a menu or a pill bottle without those glasses, you'd understand why that should have alarmed me in the first week. I gave it the most charitable explanation I could find, and moved on. That is what you do when you trust people. Marmalade. Norma had that cat for 11 years. She spoke to him in a specific register, soft, high, unself-conscious, that she reserved for him and small children. In 8 months of Sunday visits, she never mentioned him once, never asked how he was. I had looked at Marmalade on the back of the couch each Sunday morning before I left and thought, she's tired, she's resting. She'll ask when she's ready. She was never ready, because she was never far enough away to miss him. That was the conclusion I hadn't been willing to reach. And then there was the access. 1 hour, every Sunday, living room only, Megan present, Derek managing the door. In 8 months, I had never once been alone with my wife. Not for 5 minutes. Every time I called Norma's cell, Megan answered, or the call went to voicemail, and Megan called back. "Mom's resting. She'll call Sunday." I had read this as attentiveness. I was rereading it now. The morning of Derek's birthday, before I picked up the cake, I drove to my bank on Lake Avenue and requested 8 months of transfer records. I sat with the printout in my car in the bank parking lot. The numbers were not complicated. $3,200 in November, $3,200 in December. January through May, same amount, same account. Total, $25,600. Recipient, Derek A. Carter, personal checking account. Not a care facility, not a medical services provider, not a residential wellness center with a tax identification number and an intake form. A personal checking account belonging to my son-in-law. I have assessed financial documentation for 4 decades. I know what a legitimate care arrangement looks like on paper, because I priced the insurance for thousands of them. It has receipts. It has a business name. It has documentation that exists independently of someone's goodwill. What it does not have is a monthly wire to someone's personal account with nothing attached. I put the printout in the glove compartment and drove to the bakery. I want to be honest about what I felt in those 22 minutes, because people always want to know. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was the sensation of a long calculation finally resolving. A column of numbers that had refused to balance for 8 months, suddenly producing a figure at the bottom. The figure was not what I had hoped for. Everything I had dismissed as coincidence now rearranged itself into a single shape. And the shape had a name I wasn't ready to say out loud. I remembered a Sunday visit from several months earlier. Norma had been telling me something ordinary, a television program she'd been watching. And then Megan came in from the kitchen, and Norma's sentence stopped mid-thought. Just stopped, the way a tape hits the end of its reel. Norma looked at Megan. Megan looked back. Something passed between them that I had read as mother and daughter, shorthand. I was rereading it now as something with a much more specific function. I thought about Derek at the front door every Sunday. Always there before I rang, hand extended, smile preloaded, a cup of coffee appearing in my hand before I could ask. I had thought, he's making an effort. I had not thought, he is managing me the way a person manages a threshold. He is controlling the point of entry. I parked on Sycamore Lane at 5:40 in the afternoon, rang the bell, waited. Nobody came. I called Derek's cell. 4 rings, voicemail. I sent a text to Megan. No reply. I stood on the porch of 924 Sycamore Lane with a birthday cake and listened to the specific silence of a house where people are home and choosing not to answer. Megan had given me a spare key 2 years ago. Just in case, Dad, for emergencies. She'd said it casually, the way people do when they hand over keys without thinking too hard about what they might be used for. I thought, this qualifies. The key turned smoothly. The living room was dim, blinds half drawn, 2 coffee cups on the side table, a folded newspaper, a jacket over the back of a chair. Someone was home. I walked to the kitchen and set the cake on the table. Happy birthday, Derek. Blue icing, centered. I was about to leave. I had nearly decided the professional thing was to gather more information before I confronted anything directly. Then, from behind the closed bedroom door at the end of the hall, I heard a cough. Short, involuntary, with the slight whistle on the exhale that I had been listening to for 38 years. I stood in the kitchen with my hand on the back of a chair, and did not move. The refrigerator hum went silent. The calculation resolved. The number at the bottom of the column was a figure I had not budgeted for, and I had spent my entire career making sure other people didn't have to face numbers they hadn't prepared for. Now it was my turn. The morning of Derek's birthday, I was up before 6. I'm not a man who paces. Pacing is for people who don't know what to do with the energy produced by uncertainty. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and my bank printout and worked through the remaining variables methodically, the way I used to work through a mortality table. 1 column at a time, no skipping ahead. What I knew, $25,600, had been transferred to Derek Carter's personal account over 8 months. What I didn't know, whether Norma had authorized those transfers, whether she understood what she had authorized if she had, and whether what I would find at 924 Sycamore Lane today would constitute evidence or merely suspicion. An actuary draws a sharp line between those two things. By the time I left for the bakery on Colorado Boulevard, I had settled on my approach. I was going to a birthday celebration. I had a cake. I had no accusations and no confrontations planned. What I had was a question, and the question was whether the answer I was expecting to find would be there when I arrived. The rest could wait. The bakery opens at 7. The woman behind the counter recognized me. I had been in twice a year for 3 years. Always the same order. Chocolate on chocolate. Blue icing. The name in a clean sans serif font Megan had specified the first time, and that I had dutifully passed along every year since. She had my order ready. I paid $64 and carried the box to my car. The drive to Arcadia takes 22 minutes on a normal Saturday afternoon. I drove it in 25 because I was in no particular hurry, and because I was still thinking. I thought about the Sunday visits. 52 of them. No, 35, accounting for the 8 months. 35 times I had driven to that house on Sycamore Lane and spent 1 hour in a living room drinking coffee that appeared in my hand before I could ask for it, while Megan conducted the conversation and Derek stood at the perimeter of the room like a man monitoring a transaction. 35 times I had kissed my wife on the cheek and said I'd see her next week and driven home to a house that had been very quiet since October. That is a significant number of data points. In aggregate, they formed a pattern. The problem was that I had been processing them individually, in isolation, the way you process irrelevant noise. Norma was tired. Megan was attentive. Derek was hospitable. Each observation, standing alone, was benign. Together they assembled into something I should have looked at directly a long time ago. I parked on Sycamore Lane at 5:40 in the afternoon, in the same spot I always used, in front of the neighbor's oleander bush that had been losing flowers since March. I retrieved the cake from the back seat. I walked up the front path. I rang the bell. I waited. The thing about waiting on someone's porch when you know they're home is that it produces a very particular variety of silence. Not the ordinary silence of an empty house, which is flat and indifferent, but the held breath silence of a house where someone has just heard the bell and is deciding what to do about it. I have been in enough situations, professional and otherwise, to recognize the difference. This was the second kind. I rang again. I waited another full minute. Then I tried Derek's cell. 4 rings, voicemail. I sent a text to Megan, here with the cake. Ring doesn't seem to be working. That last part was a small courtesy lie. I was fairly certain the ring was working fine. No reply. I looked at the door. I looked at the key in my hand, the one Megan had pressed into my palm at a family dinner 2 winters ago, casual, over dessert, just in case. At the time I had thought of it as a gesture of inclusion, an acknowledgement that I was welcome. Standing on the porch now with a birthday cake and no answer at the door, I was revising that interpretation. The key turned without resistance. The living room was dim. Blinds half drawn, afternoon light coming in at a low angle. 2 coffee cups on the side table, both with dried rings at the bottom. A folded newspaper from earlier in the week. Derek's jacket over the back of the couch. The jacket of a man who was home. I walked to the kitchen and set the box on the table. I lifted the lid. Happy birthday, Derek, centered, the frosting still holding its edge. Clean and professional. $64 of evidence that I had continued to show up and play my role long after the other participants had stopped bothering with the formalities of theirs. I was about to close the lid. I was about to leave the cake on the table and walk back out and get in my car and sit with what I hadn't yet found and hadn't yet been able to call confirmed. And then I heard it, from the end of the hall, behind the closed door, the bedroom door which had been closed every single time I had ever been in this house, which I had filed without examination under privacy. A cough. Short. Involuntary. The slight whistle on the exhale, the one that came from a childhood bout of something that had left a small asymmetry in the airway, the one I had heard across 38 years of shared nights and shared mornings. I stood with my hand on the edge of the cake box and did not move. The sound lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then it stopped, and the house went back to its held-breath silence. I lowered the lid on the cake. Slowly, carefully, the way you close something you're not ready to open fully yet. My hand was very steady. That surprised me briefly, and then it didn't, because I had known since the bank parking lot what the bottom of this column was going to say. The cough was not a revelation. The cough was confirmation. I walked toward the bedroom door. I stood in the hallway and looked at the bedroom door. I knocked twice. Silence. Then a sound from inside, a chair leg catching on hardwood. The sound of rearrangement. Norma? A pause. Then I pressed the handle down. She was sitting on the edge of the bed in the blue bathrobe she had owned for years. I recognized the small ink stain on the left cuff from a crossword pen that had leaked. She was looking at me with an expression that contained 2 things that rarely appear together. Relief, complete and visible, like someone who has been holding their breath for a very long time. And at the same time, a specific fear that had nothing to do with me, and everything to do with what came next. I looked at the room. The nightstand held her reading glasses, exactly where she would have placed them if this were her own room. Beside them, a framed photograph of Marmalade, the original from home. In the corner, her dark green rolling suitcase, open and emptied into the closet, her blouses on hangers, her shoes arranged by heel height, the habit she never noticed she had, her hand cream on the dresser, her book on the windowsill, her small brass reading lamp from our bedroom on Oleander Drive, the one I had assumed she'd forgotten to pack. She had taken everything she needed. She had been living here fully for 8 months. I looked at Norma. How long has this been going on? I said. She opened her mouth, looked at me the way someone looks when every version of an explanation has just revealed itself as exactly what it is. She closed her mouth, and then from behind her, from the front of the house, a key in the front door lock. The timing was not accidental. They arrived within 4 minutes of when I had found Norma, before any real conversation could begin. Either they had been watching from outside, or they had a system. Either answer was instructive. Derek came in first. He stepped through the door, turned toward the hallway, saw me standing in the bedroom doorway, and stopped. He is a man who manages his face professionally. Smiles appear on cue. Concern registers when needed. But there was a half-second before his professional expression engaged where I saw something else. Not guilt. Something more calculated than guilt. The look of a man rapidly revising his position in a negotiation that had shifted. Megan followed. She looked at the kitchen table first, at the cake box, exactly where I had left it, then at me, then at her mother. The sequence of that look told me what each thing represented to her. The cake was a complication. I was a problem. Norma was a variable. 3 seconds of silence. I counted them. Then Megan said in a voice nearly level, "Nearly? Dad, you didn't have permission to come in here." My knees did something, not from weakness, from the specific physical response to a truth arriving at precisely the weight you had calculated for it. 8 months assembled into a single image. Norma's lamp on a stranger's nightstand. Her shoes in their habitual arrangement. My daughter telling me I needed permission. I had been paying $3,200 a month. I had a key. I was standing in a room that contained my wife's entire life, and I had been told I didn't have permission. Norma followed me to the hallway, her voice carrying the quality of someone reciting lines that didn't quite fit her mouth. "Herbert, they said you needed a break from... the doctor recommended." Megan cut her off. One word. Mom. Flat. Final. That single word told me more than 8 months of Sunday visits. I walked to the kitchen. I lifted the cake box from the table and placed it in front of Derek, who was standing at the counter with his hands in his pockets, watching me with the expression of a man who hasn't yet decided which version of this conversation he's going to run. "Happy birthday," I said. "Make the most of it." I walked out. The evening had the particular quality of California in June. Warm, faded gold. I got in my car. What I was feeling was not sadness. It was something drier and more precise. I drove home with Miles Davis on the stereo. The house on Oleander Drive was quiet in the familiar way, but I was sitting in that chair differently now. I had driven to Arcadia as a man with a suspicion. I drove back as a man with a confirmed loss. You don't file a claim on a suspicion. You file a claim on a confirmed loss, with documentation, with methodology, with everything in the correct column. I had the bank statement. $25,600 transferred to a personal account, with no corresponding receipts or institutional records. I had 35 Sunday visits, each one now reclassified from courtesy access to controlled access. I had Norma's reading lamp and Megan's voice telling me I needed permission to visit my own wife. I opened my laptop, I went to the California State Bar Association's attorney referral service and found a name at a firm on North Lake Avenue, a professional who specialized in California, family and property law. Not a friend, not a favor. Someone who would look at my documents and tell me precisely what I was working with. I wrote down the address. I set an appointment for 3 days later. I thought about what to bring: the bank statement, a written timeline of every Sunday visit, and confirmation of one thing I hadn't yet verified, whether Norma had signed anything. People who build these arrangements always put something on paper. I went to bed at 10. For the first time in 8 months, I slept without difficulty. Some problems, once clearly defined, become considerably less heavy. The weight hadn't disappeared. It had simply transferred from uncertainty where it is unmanageable into preparation where it is not. Derek came in first. He stepped through the front door and turned toward the hallway, and the moment his eyes found me in the kitchen doorway, something happened to his posture that he didn't intend. A full stop. Not a natural pause, but the stop of a man who has walked into a room and found the furniture rearranged. His right hand was still on the door handle. His preloaded smile hadn't engaged. For 2 full seconds I was looking at Derek Carter, without his professional surface, a man running a rapid recalculation, Then Megan came in behind him. She didn't freeze. She moved to let the door close, and her eyes made a quick sweep. Cake box on the kitchen table, her father in the doorway, her mother visible behind me on the bed. She categorized each element in the time it takes to blink. When her gaze came back to mine, her expression was composed. Not relaxed. Composed. Relaxed is effortless. Composed is a decision. 3 seconds of silence. I counted them. Then Megan said in a voice nearly level, "Dad, you didn't have permission to come in here." And there it was. My knees registered something in the way a structure registers load. 8 months arranged themselves into a single image in 4 seconds. Norma's lamp on a stranger's nightstand. Her shoes in their habitual arrangement in a stranger's closet. 35 Sunday visits managed and timed and concluded at the front door. $3,200 per month to a personal checking account, with no receipts, no institutional name, no documentation beyond the fact of the transfers, and my daughter telling me I needed permission to find my wife. I walked back to the kitchen and sat in the chair nearest the door. Norma came partway out of the bedroom and stopped in the hallway. When she spoke, her voice had the quality of someone reading from a card. "Herbert, they said you needed a break from the doctor had recommended a structured—" "Mom," Megan's voice, one word flat as a hand brought down on a table. Norma stopped. That single word, and the way Norma obeyed it, told me more about the preceding 8 months than anything else I had seen in that house. I stood up. I walked to the table. I lifted the cake box and placed it in front of Derek, who had positioned himself at the counter with his hands in his pockets, watching me with the expression of a man who hasn't yet selected which script to run. "Happy birthday," I said. "Make the most of it." I walked out into the June evening, warm, faded gold, the oleanders on the neighbor's fence giving off their faint sweetness. I got in my car. I did not cry. I did not feel the hot pressure that precedes doing something regrettable. What I felt was dry and precise and very, very clear. I drove home with Miles Davis on the stereo and sat at my kitchen table in a house that had been quiet for 8 months. I looked at the window above the sink, which showed me nothing but my own reflection. Then I opened my notebook and wrote 2 headings. On the left, what I have. On the right, what I need. Under what I have, 8 months of bank transfer records, $25,600 to a personal account with no supporting documentation. A documented pattern of controlled access over 35 weekly visits. My direct observation of Norma's fully established residence at 924 Sycamore Lane. And a document I was reasonably certain existed somewhere in that house. Something Norma had been asked to sign. Under what I need, one word. Attorney. The following morning I called the California State Bar Association's referral service and asked for a family and property law specialist in the Pasadena area. The appointment was set for 3 days out. I spent those 3 days preparing. I printed and organized the bank statements. I wrote a chronological record of every Sunday visit, 35 entries, each with date, duration, who was present, what was said, and what I had been prevented from seeing. By the time I walked into Philip Norton's office at 300 North Lake Avenue, I had 47 pages of organized documentation in a manila folder. Norton was a trim man in his mid-50s with the working office of someone who actually uses it. Books open on the credenza, a legal pad covered in handwriting. He shook my hand, offered coffee, and sat down. "Tell me what happened," he said. "Then I'll look at what you brought," I told him. 11 minutes, no editorializing, facts in sequence with amounts and timeline. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he opened the folder. After several minutes with the bank statements, he looked up. "California is a community property state. Everything accumulated during the marriage is jointly owned. The question is whether your wife's consent to these transfers was free and informed, or obtained under conditions that would make it legally questionable." He paused. "You mentioned you suspect there's a document." "I believe so. If there is," he said, "and if it was obtained without independent legal counsel advising her, we have something to work with. I'd suggest hiring an investigator." He gave me a name, Leslie Ward, who specialized in financial arrangements within families. I called her from Norton's parking lot that afternoon. She quoted a flat weekly rate of $1,400 and said, "Give me 10 days." Meanwhile, I met with financial consultant Karen Bennett, whose practice was in Arcadia. She spent 90 minutes walking me through our asset structure. The house on Oleander Drive, $1,280,000, owned jointly. My pension account, $412,000. Combined marital estate, $1,692,000. She recommended placing my pension within a revocable living trust to protect it from any marital claims in a legal proceeding. I authorized her to proceed. Cost, approximately $1,800 in legal fees. 10 days after I hired her, Leslie Ward called. "I found it," she said. The scanned document arrived by email 20 minutes later. It was titled Voluntary Residential Care Agreement. 2 pages, formatted to look official. It established that Norma Wallace, of her own free will, had agreed to reside at 924 Sycamore Lane in the care of Megan Wallace Carter and Derek Carter for an indefinite period, with housing and personal support to be funded by Herbert Wallace at a rate of $3,200 per month. At the bottom, Norma's signature, dated in October of the previous year. Above it, a notary stamp from a private notary named R. Figueroa, whose practice address was 2 blocks from Derek's real estate office. I looked at the signature for a long time. I know Norma's handwriting. I have seen it on tax returns, on the deed to our house, on 38 years of birthday cards and school permission slips. This signature was hers. But the pressure of the pen was lighter than usual. The letters were careful in the way that handwriting becomes careful when the person holding the pen is not entirely comfortable with what they are writing. Her hand had been shaking. The following morning, I brought Norton the document along with Leslie Ward's full 14-page report. He read carefully, made 2 notes on his legal pad, and set his pen down. "The notarization is the problem for them," he said. "In California, when a document involves financial commitments from a spouse of the non-signing party, there's an implied standard that the signatory had independent legal advice. There's no indication your wife spoke to an attorney before signing this. A notary's job is to verify identity, not to ensure the signatory understands their rights." He tapped the document. "This is contestable." "What's the process?" 3 filings. A claim for unjust enrichment, $25,600 received with no legitimate entitlement because the underlying agreement is legally defective. A separate filing to void the agreement itself, and a notice that you are initiating review of marital asset management on grounds of financial manipulation. He looked at me directly. "Are you prepared for this to be contested?" "I'm prepared for it to be contested," I said. "I'm also prepared for it to be resolved." He nodded. "I'll need 3 weeks for the filings. In the meantime, no contact with either of them. No calls, no emails, no responses to anything. Let my office handle all communication." I said that suited me fine. I drove home and crossed attorney off my needs list and wrote time instead. I did not call Megan. I did not call Derek. When Megan called 3 days later, the Sunday visit window had passed without my appearance. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was level and carefully worded, which told me she was uncertain in masking it. She said she hoped I was well. She said Norma sent her love. I listened to it once and deleted it. 2 weeks after the Norton meeting, Karen Bennett confirmed that the revocable trust was established. My pension account, $412,000, was properly held and protected. Legal fees, $1,780. 3 weeks after our first meeting, Norton's office sent the formal letter to 924 Sycamore Lane. I was at my kitchen table when the delivery confirmation came through on my phone. I set the phone face down and put on a record. Bill Evans, Waltz for Debbie, the original 1962 Riverside pressing. I sat by the window and waited. My phone rang 47 minutes later. Megan's name on the screen. I let it ring 3 times. Then I picked up. "Megan," I said. There was a half-second pause, the pause of someone who rehearsed the opening and hasn't received the expected cue. When she spoke, her voice was controlled but thinner than usual, the sound of a structure carrying more load than anticipated. "Dad, this is completely unnecessary. We were taking care of Mom. That's all this was. If you'd just talked to us instead of going to... Do you have receipts from the care facility? I said. Silence. The residential care facility, I said. The one that costs $3,200 a month. The pensionat. Do you have receipts from that establishment? More silence. The kind that has weight. Because Philip Norton would like to see them, I said. His address is on the letter. I heard her exhale, not a sigh, something harder than a sigh, the sound of a person recalibrating mid-position. When she spoke again, the composure was still there, but it had shifted from management to something approaching a decision about how aggressive to become. You'll regret this, she said. I've written down the number for my regrets, I said. It's $25,600. Your attorney has the documentation. I ended the call. The Evans record was still playing. Unhurried, precise, entirely unconcerned. I set the phone down. Norton had said, no contact. I had allowed myself one response. One, because it was warranted, and because the particular phrase I had used was not hostile. It was simply accurate. Accuracy has always seemed to me a reasonable basis for communication. I opened my notebook to a new page. At the top, I wrote, Phase 2. Below it, one line. Talk to Norma. Alone. Megan and Derek now knew they were being pursued through proper legal channels. What they did not yet know was that their most important witness, the one whose signature was on their document, the one whose testimony would determine whether that signature held up, was someone I could still reach. I had been patient for 8 months, without knowing I was being patient. Now I was patient on purpose. The difference, in my experience, is everything. The note in my notebook said, Talk to Norma. Alone. The practical challenge was timing. Megan worked weekdays at a marketing firm in Monrovia. Derek's real estate office was in Arcadia, and his schedule, which Leslie Ward had mapped as part of her initial report, put him in the field most weekday mornings from 9 to noon. The window I needed was midweek, mid-morning, when the house on Sycamore Lane would contain only one person. I drove there on a Tuesday. No call ahead. No announcement. I parked down the street rather than in front, which was perhaps overcautious, but I had learned to prefer overcautious. I waited 5 minutes to confirm no cars in the driveway. Then I walked up and rang the bell. Norma opened the door. She was wearing the cardigan I recognized, the gray one with the wooden buttons she'd had since the early years of retirement, which she wore when she was comfortable and not performing anything for anyone. She looked at me for a moment in the way you look at something that has appeared in an unexpected place, and then something shifted in her face, the particular shift of a person who has been waiting for something without admitting to themselves that they were waiting. Herbert, she said. Good morning, I said. May I come in? She stepped back. I came in. We sat at the kitchen table, not the living room chairs where I had been managed during Sunday visits, but the kitchen table, which is where people actually talk. She put water on for tea without asking, which was what she always did. I waited until she sat down across from me before I said anything. I want to understand what happened, I said, from the beginning, and I want you to tell me in your own words, without editing for my benefit. She looked at her hands, then she looked at me, and she talked. It had started, she said, about a year before the arrangement, well before October. Megan had been visiting more frequently, coming alone, asking careful questions. How was he doing? Was he sleeping? Had she noticed anything concerning? The questions were wrapped in daughterly concern so smoothly that Norma had accepted each one without turning it over to look at the underside. Then over several months, the picture Megan painted slowly shifted. Herbert was struggling with the transition to retirement. He seemed low. He'd been distant. A doctor, Megan mentioned a name, a specialist, someone she'd spoken to, had suggested that a structured separation might help both of them. Just a rest, just some space. Norma had asked, did Herbert know about this? And Megan had said yes. He'd agreed to it. He thought it was a good idea. He just didn't want to say so directly because he found that kind of conversation difficult. I believed her, Norma said. Her voice was even, but there was something underneath it that had been living there for a while. She's our daughter. I believed her. The paper had appeared at the end of that same conversation. Just a formality, Megan said. Something for record-keeping purposes, to establish the arrangement properly. There was a man waiting outside in a car who came in briefly and watched Norma sign. She hadn't read it carefully. She had trusted that if her daughter was asking her to sign something, it was what her daughter said it was. I did not interrupt. I had learned in 4 decades of working with numbers that the most important thing you can do when someone is giving you data is to not contaminate it with your own responses until they've finished. After a while, Norma continued, I started asking when I could go home, and Megan would say soon that you needed more time, that the doctor had recommended extending the arrangement. And I would think, he seems fine when he visits. He seems calm. But I also thought... She stopped. I thought maybe I wasn't seeing everything. She had wanted to ask me directly. Several times during Sunday visits, she had started to. But Megan was always there, and each time Norma opened her mouth, something, a look, a redirected question, a topic changed, had made the direct question impossible. She learned that from being organized, I said. Not malicious, organized. Norma looked at me. Does that make a difference? To the law, yes, I said. To me, not particularly. I asked her about the document. She went to the bedroom and came back with a plain white envelope. Inside was a copy. She had kept a copy, a detail Megan had apparently not anticipated or had considered too minor to address. I looked at the signature, the notary stamp, the careful bureaucratic language that Derek had assembled to make a private financial arrangement look like an institutional record. Norma, I said, I have an attorney. His name is Philip Norton. He's filed documents on my behalf, and the legal process has already started. But your testimony, what you've just told me, formally, on record, is the strongest element in the case. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the Arcadia morning was heating up, the kind of June warmth that starts politely and becomes insistent by afternoon. What does testifying involve? She asked. Telling a lawyer what you told me. In writing first, a formal declaration, possibly in front of a judge, if it comes to that, though Norton thinks it won't. She looked at her hands again, then, Megan is my daughter. Yes, I said. She is. Another silence. I let it run. All right, she said. I called Philip Norton from the car before I started the engine. 3 words. Start filing documents. Norton filed on a Thursday, and the formal notice arrived at 924 Sycamore Lane the following Monday, by certified mail. Signature required, which meant someone had to be home to accept it, which meant the moment of receipt was documented. The filing contained 3 actions. First, a claim for unjust enrichment in the amount of $25,600 against Derek A. Carter, on grounds that the payments were made pursuant to an agreement that was legally defective and obtained without the informed consent of the signing party. Second, a petition to void the voluntary residential care agreement of October 2024, on grounds that it was executed without independent legal counsel and under conditions that constituted undue influence. Third, a notice of initiation of marital asset review proceedings, citing documented financial manipulation as grounds. That same evening, my phone rang. Megan, I let it ring once, just once, enough to register that I was choosing to answer rather than defaulting to it, and picked up. Her voice was controlled, more controlled than it had been during the call after the initial letter, which told me that in the intervening weeks she had thought carefully about how to play this. There was still thinness in it, the structural thinness of someone caring more than the surface shows, but the panic that had been briefly audible before had been managed back down. Dad, this is completely unnecessary, she said. We were taking care of Mom. That's all this was. If you'd just talked to us instead of... Do you have receipts from the care facility? I said. The pause that followed had a specific texture. Not the pause of someone thinking of an answer, but the pause of someone absorbing the fact that an answer doesn't exist. Philip Norton would like to see them, I said. His address is on the letter. You'll regret this, she said, and her voice had hardened into something that was not quite anger, but was adjacent to it. The tone of a person who has decided that the softness wasn't working. I've written down the number for my regrets, I said. It comes to $25,600. Your attorney has the documentation. I ended the call. 2 days later, Norton called me. They've retained counsel, he said. Someone named Garvey, family litigation. They're positioning the $25,600 as a voluntary gift for household support. I expected that, I said. I know. Ward's financial report addresses it fairly directly. What I want you to be aware of is that Garvey has also requested a continuance on the asset review filing, essentially trying to slow down that piece of the process. Standard move, I filed a response. And Norma's declaration? Received and entered. Very clean. Her account of how the agreement was obtained is exactly what we needed. A brief pause. There's one more thing. Ward called this morning with something you should see. He forwarded it that afternoon. A screenshot, obtained through Ward's investigative work, of a private message Derek had sent to a friend about 6 months into the arrangement. The message was brief. It said, "Old guy's got maybe another year or two, then the house is ours." I looked at it on my phone screen for a long moment. Then I forwarded it to my printer, walked to the study, collected the printed page, and placed it in the manila folder I had labeled Documentation. Wallace versus Carter. I wrote on a sticky note, Exhibit 14, and pressed it to the top right corner. 14 items in the folder. The column under what I have in my notebook was now longer than the column under what I need. What I didn't yet know was what Megan was about to do next. I found out 10 days later when Norton called and used a tone I had not heard from him before. Not alarmed, but attentive in a way that sharpened my own attention immediately. "They've filed a counterclaim," he said. "Megan is alleging that you subjected Norma to psychological pressure throughout the marriage, and that the October arrangement was Norma's voluntary choice to create a safe distance. She's also requested the court order an independent cognitive assessment of you." I absorbed this for a moment. "On what grounds?" I said. "She's suggesting that your filing of these claims, the precision of the documentation, the scope, is inconsistent with normal behavior for a person in their late 60s and may indicate obsessive cognition." I considered that for approximately 3 seconds. "Philip," I said, "please schedule the assessment at the earliest available date. I want it done and on record before the first hearing." A pause on his end. "Most people resist." "Most people are not actuaries," I said. "I have spent my career building cases on documented evidence. The fastest way to neutralize a claim about my cognitive state is to produce documented evidence about my cognitive state. Schedule the assessment." "I'll call UCLA Medical Center this afternoon," he said. I hung up. I opened my notebook. Under what I need, I wrote, "Assessment results." Under it, slightly smaller, I wrote, "They're scared. Scared people make mistakes." I had spent 42 years watching institutions make expensive mistakes when they were scared. The pattern is always the same. They overextend, they overclaim, they produce more paper than they can defend. Megan had just produced more paper than she could defend. I went to the kitchen, put on the kettle, and waited for it to boil, which is something I do when I am thinking, and do not need to perform thinking for anyone. The house was quiet. The folder on the desk had 14 items in it. By the time the assessment was scheduled, it would have 15. The cognitive assessment was scheduled at UCLA Medical Center 12 days after Norton filed the counterclaim response. I drove to Westwood alone and spent 2 hours and 40 minutes with a clinician who administered a standardized battery. Memory sequencing, spatial reasoning, verbal fluency, executive function. I found the tasks straightforward. 3 working days later, Norton received the written assessment. 2 pages, signed and stamped. Summary: cognitive function within normal range for a male in the late 60s, with particular strength in working memory and sequential reasoning. Norton forwarded it to Garvey's office with a cover note I approved. "Please find enclosed the independent neuropsychological assessment requested by your client. We trust this resolves the matter." Filed as Exhibit 15. What happened next came in a sequence I had not predicted precisely, though I had modeled the general shape of it. Megan's counterclaim, the allegation of psychological pressure throughout the marriage, required her to produce evidence. Garvey sent over a list of 3 witnesses, 2 friends of Megan's who had agreed to provide statements, and Megan herself. Norton reviewed their statements and described them to me as impressionistic. He used that word specifically, and I understood what it meant. Subjective accounts of atmosphere and feeling, with no documented incidents, no dates, no specifics. The kind of material that does not hold up well when placed next to a 14-item documentation folder and assigned cognitive assessment. Meanwhile, Norma moved back to Oleander Drive. She came on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after Norton filed, without drama, with her green rolling suitcase and the cardigan with the wooden buttons, and Marmalade's photograph carried separately, not packed. She had called the morning before and said she was coming home. I said, all right. Norton had suggested we document the return. She signed a notarized voluntary statement confirming she was returning of her own accord. Cost, $180. Filed as Exhibit 16. Megan did not speak to her mother for 2 weeks after that. Norma told me over dinner, without editorializing. I didn't editorialize either. The hearing was set for a Monday in late September. I arrived with Norton 20 minutes early. I wore the gray suit I keep for formal occasions and sat in the second row behind Norton's table. Derek and Megan sat across the aisle with Garvey. Derek was in a blue blazer that read as effortful rather than confident. He did not look at me. Megan looked at me once, briefly. I looked back with no particular expression. Garvey led with the voluntary gift argument. The $25,600 represented informal family financial support, provided willingly by Herbert Wallace for the care of his wife, with no expectation of return. He cited the absence of any written loan agreement. Norton waited until Garvey had finished. Then he placed 3 items before the court. The first was the bank transfer record, $3,200, 8 identical payments, all to the same personal account, beginning the same month as the voluntary residential care agreement was signed. The consistency of amount and timing, Norton noted, was not consistent with informal gifts, which vary. It was consistent with a payment schedule. The second was Norma's signed declaration describing the conditions under which the agreement had been obtained, the representation that Herbert had agreed to the arrangement, the paper presented for signature without explanation, the notary who arrived and departed without speaking to her about the document's contents. The third was Exhibit 14, Derek's private message to a friend, obtained through legally conducted investigation. Old guy's got maybe another year or two. Then the house is ours. The judge read all 3. She looked at the message a moment longer than the other documents. Then she asked Garvey to explain how a message expressing anticipation of acquiring Herbert Wallace's property was consistent with characterizing the payments as ordinary family support. Garvey said the message was taken out of context. The judge said she would like to hear the context. A pause of 6 seconds followed. Garvey produced no context. Derek, beside him, had the stillness of someone who has run out of available movements. The ruling came at the end of the hearing. The voluntary residential care agreement was voided. The $25,600 was to be repaid to Herbert Wallace within 30 days. The counterclaim alleging psychological pressure was dismissed for insufficient evidentiary support. The hearing adjourned. Derek stood up first. He buttoned his jacket, the automatic gesture of someone who has been sitting and is now standing, performed without awareness, and walked toward the door. I had collected my documents and was walking the same direction, and we crossed paths in the narrow corridor outside the courtroom doors. I stopped. He stopped because there was not quite enough room to pass without acknowledgement. I said quietly, so that only he could hear, "You measured everything in dollars. So did I. I was just more precise." He looked at me. His face had the quality of a man who has prepared several possible responses to several possible things, and has just encountered the one he hadn't prepared for. He said nothing. I walked to the car. Norton was already outside. He shook my hand once, firmly, and said, "Well done." I said, "You did the work." He said, "You brought the folder." We drove back to Pasadena. The San Gabriel Mountains were clear. The appeal was filed 17 days after the ruling. Norton called in the tone of a man noting a predictable weather pattern. Garvey filed on both the unjust enrichment judgment and the agreement voiding. Standard grounds. "Their actual chances?" I said. "Under 10%. The evidentiary record is strong. The message didn't help their position. The appeal was denied 5 weeks later. The written decision was 4 pages. Norton emailed it, I printed it, and moved the entire documentation folder from my desk to the filing cabinet, where it no longer needed to be immediately accessible. The $25,600 arrived by bank transfer on a Thursday in mid-October. I received the confirmation notification on my phone while I was in the kitchen making coffee. I looked at it for a moment, then set the phone down and finished making the coffee. I called Karen Bennett that afternoon to review the asset structure. The house on Oleander Drive, $1,280,000, jointly owned, unchanged. My pension account, $412,000, held in the Revocable Living Trust, properly protected. Total legal and investigative costs across the entire proceeding, $9,340. Norton's fees, Ward's weekly rate across 11 weeks, Bennett's consulting hours, and the assessment at UCLA. Net recovery, $25,600 minus $9,340, which left $16,260 returned to the position I had held before the arrangement began, plus interest, which Norton had included in the filing, and which added $1,820. The final number was $18,080 recovered, net of all costs. I wrote it in my notebook. It was a clean number, not a large one in absolute terms, but accuracy was never about the size of the figure. It was about the column being correct. 2 weeks after the transfer, Megan came to the house on Oleander Drive. She came alone. No Derek. She rang the bell at 10 in the morning on a Saturday. I was in the kitchen, Norma was reading in the back room, and I opened the door and she was standing on the porch in a coat she'd had for years, looking at the doormat rather than at me. When she looked up, her face had none of the composure I had been watching her deploy for 9 months. It just had her face on it, which is something I hadn't seen clearly in a long time. I stepped back. She came in. I made coffee, 2 cups, and put one in front of her at the kitchen table and sat across from her. She said, "I thought I was doing what was right." I looked at her. I let the sentence sit in the room for a moment, the way you let a note sustain before you move to the next one. Then I said, "No, you didn't think about what was right. You thought about what you wanted. Those are different calculations." She was quiet. "The calculation you ran," I said, "was about what would happen to the house and the accounts when I was gone. You just started running it before I was gone, which was the part you got wrong." She looked at her coffee cup. "I was afraid." "I know what you were afraid of," I said. "You were afraid the numbers wouldn't work out the way you wanted them to." "So you tried to manage the numbers?" She didn't have anything to say to that. I hadn't expected her to. She didn't leave immediately. She sat for another 20 minutes, and Norma came in from the back room and sat down too. And the 3 of us were in the kitchen together for the first time in nearly a year, and nobody said anything that particularly needed to be said. There was coffee. There was the sound of the neighbor's dog somewhere down Oleander Drive. There was the ordinary weight of a family sitting in a room with something unresolved between them that would probably remain unresolved for a while, which is not the same as being unfinished. Megan left without hugging anyone. At the door, she paused with her hand on the frame and said, "I'll call." I said, "All right." She left. Norma had been seeing a psychologist since the 3rd week after she came home. Her own choice, her own referral, an appointment she made without discussion and told me about afterward. She went on Thursday afternoons. What she said there was between her and her doctor, and I did not ask. We talked more than we had before. Not about the 9 months, not directly, not often, but about other things. The garden, the news, whether the living room needed repainting, the kind of conversations that fill a house back up after it's been quiet for too long. On the last Saturday of October, I went to the Antique and Collectibles auction on Colorado Boulevard. At 11:15, a lot came up, a 1956 Riverside pressing of Chet Baker's Chet Baker Sings, original label, jacket worn at the corners, vinyl well-maintained. The bidding opened at $80 and reached $140. I stopped at $125. The man who bought it looked at it the way you look at something you understand the value of. I drove home with nothing purchased and sat in my chair by the window. The morning had been exactly what it was, which was sufficient. Norma brought coffee without being asked, which she has done for most of the 38 years I have known her, and sat in the chair across from me. Marmalade settled on the arm of the couch in the patch of afternoon sunlight he has claimed since the first winter we brought him home. I looked at the room, everything where it belonged. An actuary calculates the probability of loss so that the loss, when it comes, does not destroy what remains. That is the whole job, stated simply. You cannot prevent the loss. You can only be ready for it, document it accurately, and ensure that what comes after is built on correct numbers. Some things, I've come to understand, do not go in the loss column. Some things you recover. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.